By April 1945, Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a dying monument to a collapsing regime. The once grand avenues were now trenches of rubble, choked by smoke and the smell of burning timber. Buildings that had stood for centuries had become hollow shells, their windows shattered, their roofs torn open by Allied bombs. Civilians moved like ghosts through the wreckage, clutching what little remained of their lives. Inside the city, the Nazi leadership refused to accept reality. Propaganda, broadcasts still promised miracle weapons and heroic counterattacks, but everyone knew the truth. Soviet artillery was already pounding the outskirts, and the Red Army's advance was unstoppable. Hitler had retreated into the Führerbunker weeks earlier, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists who spoke in whispers and avoided his eyes. The city's defenses were a patchwork of Volkssturm battalions, old men, young boys, and wounded soldiers pulled from hospitals. They wore mismatched uniforms and carried whatever weapons could still be found. Many had no ammunition. Others had never fired a gun. Yet orders insisted, fight to the last man. Rumors spread that Heinrich Himmler was negotiating behind Hitler's back. Goebbels raged at the betrayal. Generals arrived in the bunker to deliver impossible news. Whole divisions had ceased to exist overnight. Ammunition was gone. Fuel reserves were dust. But Hitler dismissed every report as defeatism or treason. Above ground, Berlin braced for the storm. Artillery flashes lit the horizon like distant lightning. The sound rolled across the city in steady waves. The Führerbunker, buried beneath the Reich Chancellery garden, was a claustrophobic labyrinth of concrete corridors, dim lights, and stale air. The deeper one walked, the more the world above felt like a fading dream. Officers moved through the narrow hallways with rigid precision, their boots echoing like hammer blows against the walls. Hitler spent most of his days in the conference room or his private study, pacing with restless energy, clutching trembling hands behind his back. His appearance shocked even those who had not seen him in months, a shuffling, frail figure with sunken cheeks and a right hand that never stopped shaking. The once commanding voice now cracked with strain, rising into furious tirades before collapsing into exhausted silence. Generals brought maps to the bunker, but frontline positions changed faster than the ink dried. Soviet forces were encircling Berlin from every direction. Communications broke down hourly. Entire units vanished without explanation. Hitler demanded counterattacks from divisions that existed only on paper. Despite the hopeless situation, the bunker staff maintained a strange routine. Secretaries typed until their fingers bled. Messengers sprinted between rooms carrying orders no one could obey. The smell of cheap cigarettes and cold coffee hung in the air. Even music still played on occasion. Soft, scratchy melodies that echoed through the corridors like the last breath of a doomed world. At night, the bunker walls shook with every Soviet bombardment. Dust drifted from the ceiling, glasses rattled on tables. Some officers flinched, others stared blankly. Above them, Berlin burned. But below ground, Hitler's world shrank to a few dim rooms where time moved like a slow, suffocating tide. By April 25th, Berlin was fully encircled. Soviet armies under Zhukov and Konev met on the city's western outskirts, sealing the fate of the German capital. Inside the ring, chaos deepened. Food was scarce. Electricity failed across entire districts. Civilians crowded into U-Bahn tunnels, listening to the thunder of artillery overhead as the city shook like a wounded animal. On the surface, the fight became raw and desperate. Panzerfaust teams hid behind rubble, emerging only to fire at advancing Soviet tanks before retreating into basements. SS officers executed anyone who attempted to surrender. Fires burned unchecked. The sky turned black with smoke. From the bunker, Hitler issued orders disconnected from reality. He insisted that Steiner's non-existent army group launch a counter-offensive. When generals informed him that Steiner had no tanks, no fuel, and barely 1,000 exhausted soldiers, Hitler exploded in rage. Witnesses described the moment as the breaking point, not just of the war, but of Hitler himself. After the outburst, he slumped into a chair and whispered, "Everything is lost." Yet the fighting continued. Soviet troops advanced street by street, marking captured buildings with chalk. They used artillery to blast through strong points, sending shock waves that rippled through the city. The Reichstag, blackened and broken, loomed in the distance. The final objective. For Berliners trapped between two armies, each hour felt like a lifetime. They could only wait, listening to the city around them collapse and hoping the end would come quickly. As the Soviets closed in, the bunker became a twisted microcosm of loyalty, fear, and delusion. Joseph Goebbels stalked the hallways like a specter, ranting about betrayal and vowing that Germany would rise again from the ashes of sacrifice. His wife Magda remained eerily calm, writing farewell letters and visiting the bunker's nursery where their 6 children played, blissfully unaware of what she planned for them. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of terror, had fled Berlin and attempted to negotiate with the Western Allies without Hitler's knowledge. When Hitler learned of this betrayal, he erupted into fury, declaring Himmler a traitor to be shot on sight. The bunker staff exchanged uneasy glances. The regime was devouring itself. Albert Speer arrived to confess that he had secretly disobeyed Hitler's orders to destroy Germany's remaining infrastructure. Surprisingly, Hitler reacted not with rage, but with weary resignation. "Do what you want," he murmured. Outside, the Soviets tightened their grip on the government district. Artillery shells pulverized the Chancellery gardens. The bunker lights flickered with each impact. Officers slept in their uniforms, pistols within reach. Hitler's world was collapsing, yet a handful of loyalists refused to abandon him. They spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice, but beneath their words was fear. Fear of the Soviets, fear of betrayal, fear of living in a world without the man they had followed for so long. In the bunker's suffocating air, everyone sensed the end drawing near. On April 29th, after reading reports confirming that Berlin would fall within days, Hitler summoned his staff for one last meeting. His hands shook uncontrollably. His gaze drifted. Yet his voice, tired, hollow, carried a finality that silenced the room. He declared that he would not flee Berlin. He would not be captured. He would not give the Allies the satisfaction of seeing him in chains. Instead, he would choose the moment and manner of his own end. Eva Braun, who had refused to leave his side, agreed to remain with him to the last. They were married in a brief, somber ceremony conducted in the bunker's small map room, surrounded by aides who tried to hide their unease. Hitler dictated his final political testament, blaming Jews, generals, and traitors for the downfall he had caused. As he spoke, the bunker walls shook with artillery, dust falling like ash from the ceiling. Outside, Soviet soldiers were fighting their way through the ruins of the Chancellery gardens. Later that day, he met with his remaining generals. Their forces were shattered, their positions hopeless. Hitler listened, then dismissed them with a faint wave of the hand. When they left, He turned to his staff and quietly said, "It is time." The bunker fell silent. Everyone knew what would happen next, but no one dared speak. Above the bunker, Berlin's last defenders were being scraped from the bottom of the barrel of a ruined empire. The once proud Wehrmacht had been bled dry on the Eastern Front. What remained in the capital was a tragic mixture of fanatics, survivors, and the unprepared. The Volkssturm, a people's army in name only, filled the trenches and barricades with men well past 50 and boys who should have still been in school. Their uniforms were a collage of old greatcoats, Hitler Youth armbands, and captured foreign gear. Many carried Panzerfausts without ever having fired one. Propaganda officers told them that history watched their stand, that Berlin would become a new Verdun, a fortress whose sacrifice would inspire future generations. But as Soviet shells tore through apartment blocks and set entire streets ablaze, those lofty words shrank to the size of a single building, a single corner, a single doorway to be defended. Mothers watched sons march out with rifles too big for their shoulders. Some boys ran to the front without telling their parents at all, fearing they would be held back. Inside the city, law and order dissolved. Looters roamed bombed-out shops. SS patrols shot suspected deserters on sight. Hospitals overflowed with wounded, operating by candlelight amid the constant tremor of distant explosions. In U-Bahn tunnels, thousands of civilians lay side by side on the cold concrete, listening to the rumble of tanks overhead and wondering if the ceiling would hold. For them, the fall of Berlin was not a strategic concept. It was the sound of collapsing stairwells, the sting of dust in their lungs, the taste of the last crust of bread. And yet, clinging to rumors and whispers, many still believed, or tried to believe, that some miracle would save them at the 11th hour. As Soviet forces closed in on the city center, the fight narrowed to a deadly funnel pointing straight toward the Reich Chancellery and the Reichstag. The government quarter became a maze of barricades, anti-tank obstacles, and hastily dug trenches. Every ministry building, every police station, every courtyard was transformed into a strong point. German officers poured their dwindling resources into this final redoubt, determined to delay the inevitable for as long as possible. Soviet assault groups advanced with brutal efficiency. They moved through shattered buildings rather than open streets, blasting holes through walls to create improvised passageways. Tanks rumbled forward in short, explosive bursts, firing almost point-blank into windows and doorways before rolling back into cover. Flamethrower teams turned basements into furnaces. Machine gunners set up in stairwells to cut down counterattacks. The Luftwaffe was powerless. German aircraft rarely appeared over the city. When they did, they were quickly driven off. Artillery did the talking now. Soviet batteries pounded the government quarter from across the Spree, their shells walking steadily closer to the Chancellery gardens and the bunker hidden beneath them. Trees in the Tiergarten were reduced to jagged stumps. Statues lay decapitated in the dust. Among the defenders were SS units sworn to fight to the last, foreign volunteers from occupied countries, and remnants of elite formations that had retreated into the city. Many fought with grim determination. Others were simply trapped, with no route of escape and no command structure left to obey. Fierce firefights erupted inside ministries whose corridors were lined with portraits of the very leaders whose regime was collapsing outside. From the bunker, Hitler received fragmented reports of the battle raging just a few hundred meters away. On the maps spread before him, colored pins still represented divisions and regiments. In the streets above, those divisions had dwindled to a few exhausted men holding a single floor of a single building against the advancing tide. April 30th dawned under a sky veiled by smoke. In the bunker, the air was heavy and unmoving, thick with the smell of fuel, sweat, and fear. Outside, Soviet troops were fighting in the ruins of the chancellery itself. The sound of automatic fire and exploding shells seeped into the underground corridors like a violent heartbeat. Hitler rose late, older than his 56 years by a lifetime. His staff noticed how his steps dragged, how his gaze lingered on details that had once meant nothing. A chipped cup, a painting askew on the wall. He met briefly with those who remained closest to him. Goebbels, Bormann, a few generals whose authority now existed only in memory. They discussed fantasy armies that would never arrive, relief attacks that existed only on crumpled maps. The conversations felt ritualistic, a script that everyone knew no longer applied. Shortly before midday, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private room after taking leave of several staff members. The atmosphere in the bunker shifted. Whispered conversations stopped. People moved more softly, as if noise itself might break whatever fragile barrier separated them from the decision being carried out behind the closed door. Some officers stared at the floor, others at the ceiling as dust drifted from fresh impacts above. Minutes stretched. A muffled sound came from the study, indistinct amid the distant explosions. When the door was finally opened, those who entered found the scene they had expected, yet dreaded. The details would be argued over for decades, but one fact was undeniable. The man who had ruled Germany with absolute power, who had plunged Europe into catastrophe, was gone. In the corridors, the news moved quickly, carried in choked whispers. He is dead. Reactions were mixed. Shock, disbelief, quiet nods, even moments of relief. Some broke down in tears, unable to imagine a future without the leader they had followed for so long. Others retreated to their rooms, suddenly aware that nothing now stood between them and the approaching Soviet army. Above, the battle for Berlin continued unabated. For the soldiers fighting in the streets, nothing had changed in that instant. But in the bunker, history had turned a page. Hitler's death did not bring order. It accelerated disintegration. Admiral Karl Dönitz was named his successor in a hastily prepared testament, but he was far away in northern Germany. In the bunker, power fractured. Joseph Goebbels remained in Berlin, now nominally the Reich Chancellor, presiding over a government that no longer governed anything. Some officers attempted to negotiate localized surrenders. Others planned breakout attempts, hoping to slip through Soviet lines under cover of darkness and reach Western forces to avoid falling into Soviet hands. The corridors buzzed with arguments, hurried consultations, the clatter of typewriters drafting last-minute documents that no one would ever read. One of the darkest decisions unfolded in the quiet bunker nursery. Magda Goebbels, convinced that her children could not live in a world without National Socialism, resolved to kill them. She dressed them in their best clothes, gave them sedatives, and, with the help of an SS doctor, ended their lives. The act cast a chilling shadow over the bunker, a final, terrible expression of the regime's fanatical self-destruction. That same night, Joseph and Magda Goebbels walked into the ruined Chancellery garden. Moments later, shots rang out. Their bodies were burned with gasoline, repeating the ritual carried out for Hitler hours earlier. Other senior figures chose cyanide. Some shot themselves. A few officers gathered what courage they had left and tried to break out through the Soviet encirclement in small groups, slipping through rubble-strewn streets under fire and surrendering when they could go no farther. For the Soviet troops closing in, the bunker was simply another objective, one more strong point to be reduced. For those inside, it had become a tomb, not only for individuals, but for an entire ideology. The Third Reich, which had promised a 1,000-year empire, had imploded in a handful of days beneath a government garden reduced to ash. In the days following Hitler's death, the thunder of battle slowly faded into sporadic bursts of gunfire. By May 2nd, the last major pockets of resistance in Berlin had surrendered or been overwhelmed. Soviet soldiers moved through streets lined with the husks of trams and tanks, past buildings whose interiors lay open to the sky like broken dollhouses. The city that had once styled itself the heart of a mighty empire was now a landscape of ruins. For the Red Army, the capture of Berlin was both triumph and reckoning. Troops posed for photographs beneath captured eagles and shattered swastikas. Others stood silently, staring at the devastation. They had marched from the Volga to the Spree, through frozen fields, burned villages and mass graves, losing comrades at every step. Now they had reached the end of that journey. Victory tasted of smoke and exhaustion. Civilians emerged cautiously from basements and shelters, blinking in the strange half-light that filtered through dust clouds. Some approached Soviet soldiers with raised hands, others with desperate pleas for food or protection. The occupiers, themselves scarred by years of war and propaganda, reacted in ways that ranged from compassion to cruelty. The moral landscape, like the physical one, was shattered. In the larger world, the fall of Berlin sent shockwaves. Radio broadcasts across Europe announced the death of Hitler and the collapse of Nazi Germany's capital. For millions who had suffered under occupation, it signaled that the long nightmare was nearly over. In Allied capitals, bells rang and crowds gathered, celebrating a victory purchased at a cost that could never truly be counted. Yet amid the jubilation, Berlin stood as a warning, a city reduced to rubble by ideology, hubris, and total war. The bunker was sealed. The chancellery lay in ruins. The Reichstag bore scorch marks and shell holes like scars. The regime that had promised glory had left only ash. For historians, soldiers, and survivors alike, the final days of Hitler and the fall of Berlin became more than just an ending. They were a cautionary tale about power without restraint, loyalty without conscience, and the fragile line that separates civilization from catastrophe. When Berlin's surface became too dangerous to traverse, both soldiers and civilians fled into the tunnels beneath the streets, the U-Bahn and S-Bahn networks that crisscrossed the capital like arteries. Down there, the air was cold and stale, filled with the smell of damp concrete, gasoline, and unwashed bodies. Thousands of civilians huddled along the platforms, surrounded by bundles of belongings, listening to the muffled thunder of war above their heads. But the tunnels were no sanctuary. Soviet assault groups moved underground to bypass barricades and avoid sniper fire. German units retreated into the same tunnels, setting up ambushes among the flickering electric lights. Firefights erupted in narrow corridors where muzzle flashes illuminated terrified faces for milliseconds at a time. The flooding began when demolition teams blew canal locks to slow the Soviet advance. Water surged through lower tunnels, sweeping away debris. And people. Panic spread through the underground like wildfire. Mothers clutched children as water rose to their waists. Soldiers struggled to keep their weapons dry while guiding civilians to higher platforms. Entire routes became impassable, trapping pockets of refugees in darkness. Some tunnels filled with toxic smoke from burning buildings above. Others collapsed from bombardments that shook the earth, burying entrances under tons of rubble. Those who survived emerged hours later into streets unrecognizable from memory. A hellscape of molten tram rails, overturned vehicles, and dust clouds that turned the sky gray. Even beneath the city, Berlin was dying. The war had reached every corner, every level, every breath of the capital. And still, the fighting continued. As the Reich crumbled, communication lines disintegrated. Radio operators sat at their posts amid shattered equipment, tapping out signals to units that no longer existed. Some sent desperate pleas for reinforcements. Others transmitted raw, unfiltered despair. Most messages vanished into silence. Inside the bunker, staff officers drafted frantic reports with no audience left to read them. Outside, German commanders received contradictory orders: defend, counterattack, retreat, stand firm. No one could agree on anything. The structure of the Reich, once rigid and authoritarian, had dissolved into chaos. Meanwhile, Soviet intercept teams listened to fragments of the collapse. They heard the crackling voices of German officers arguing, shouting, breaking down. They heard messages that ended mid-sentence, cut off by shell fire or surrender. They heard the final broadcasts from the propaganda ministry urging civilians to fight until the last breath, even as Goebbels himself prepared for suicide. One of the last coherent messages came from General Weidling, who commanded the defense of the city. He reported the situation as hopeless, ammunition exhausted, lines broken, and surrendered shortly thereafter. For most defenders, the war was already lost in their hearts. Now it became official in their orders. Across Berlin, the last functioning radios sputtered out. The city's voice, a voice once used to command, threaten, and boast, was reduced to static. By the final night, Berlin resembled the ruins of some ancient fallen empire. Flames carved the skyline, leaping from building to building, as if trying to consume the last remnants of the city before the Soviets could claim them. Explosions from ammunition depots lit the streets in bursts of white light. The smell of burning wood, fuel, and brick dust hung over everything like a suffocating blanket. Soviet soldiers advanced cautiously through this inferno, stepping over shattered rail lines, crushed vehicles, and pools of water reflecting fire like broken mirrors. They cleared floors of buildings that were barely standing, their walls cracked and swaying from the heat. Some houses burned so fiercely that entire facades collapsed into the street, sending shock waves of sparks into the air. Civilians wandered like ghosts through the wreckage, dazed, barefoot, soot-covered, clutching family photos or the last scraps of food. They moved without direction, some searching for lost relatives, others simply seeking air that wasn't filled with smoke. A few approached Soviet units with trembling hands raised, begging for protection from the chaos. In the Chancellery Gardens, the fires cast grotesque shadows over the cratered ground. The bunker entrance was half covered by rubble. The once pristine structure had become a burnt shell. Near the Reichstag, trees stood like charred skeletons, their branches twisted by heat. The Spree River glowed with reflections of burning buildings. Berlin wasn't just falling, it was burning itself out, consuming the last of its fury before dawn. May 2nd, 1945. Dawn arrived quietly over the ruins. White flags began appearing across the city, bedsheets, tablecloths, curtains tied to sticks. Entire units emerged from basements and makeshift trenches with hands raised, exhausted, hollow-eyed, starving. Soviet soldiers directed them into holding areas while engineers worked to clear mines and explosives left behind by retreating SS units. General Weidling formally surrendered Berlin to Soviet forces. The terms were simple. All organized resistance was to cease immediately. Weapons were to be turned over. Any further fighting would be considered criminal. For the civilians, it was the first morning in weeks without shellfire. Mothers stepped out of shelters, into the pale light, crying quietly. Children crept forward, curious but afraid. Soldiers, both Soviet and German, moved through the streets with weary caution, unsure whether the silence would hold. In the bunker, the last officers prepared to leave or be captured. Doors were sealed, documents burned, the labyrinth of corridors emptied. The regime that once sought to dominate Europe ended in a dark underground maze beneath a dead city. Across Berlin, the Red Army raised the red banner not just over the Reichstag, but over every district, one flag after another symbolizing the end of the bloodiest war in human history. Berlin's fall did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it revealed the staggering scale of destruction. Streets were impassable, choked with rubble. Water systems were shattered, hospitals overflowed. Bodies lay under collapsed buildings, unreachable for days. Children wandered alone, crying for parents who would never return. For Soviet soldiers, victory felt both monumental and hollow. They had marched thousands of kilometers from Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Don. They had endured winters, hunger, and relentless combat. Now, in the heart of the enemy capital, they stood surrounded by ruins that testified to the price of victory. Yet there was triumph, too, the knowledge that the war, at least in Europe, was virtually over, that the tyrant who started it was dead, that millions who suffered under occupation would finally be free. At Treptower Park, Soviet units prepared to bury comrades in a memorial that would symbolize both victory and loss. In the weeks that followed, Berlin slowly began to breathe again. Streets were cleared, food was distributed. Survivors emerged from basements and cellars like seedlings reaching for the sun after a long winter. The city would rebuild, but it would never be the same. And so the story of Hitler's last days ends not only with the collapse of a regime, but with the rebirth of a city, shattered, scarred, but alive.